Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in another Catholic Civics webinar. Today, we're here for the third discussion in our series on faith and science titled The Beauty of Creation. Before we begin, I'd like to start with an opening prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glorious Saint Albert, guide to good purpose the inventors and scientists. Intercede for modern science and technology to be used responsibly and ethically in the service of life, justice, and peace. God, you made St. Albert great by enabling him to combine human wisdom and divine faith. Help us to adhere to his teaching that we may progress in the sciences and at the same time come to a deeper understanding and love of you. God, we ask that you help us come together over these coming months to bring humility to our pursuit of knowledge and wisdom in faith and science, to our public lives as neighbors and citizens. Let us seek to bring our hearts and minds together in search of a deeper understanding of your creation, applying what we know to new contexts, seeing what novelty is ever unfolding in your ordered creation, and how it is continuous with what has already been revealed to us in the book of nature and the book of Scripture. The Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. So, hello, and thank you to everyone who's joined us from coast to coast in Canada and hopefully some south of the border and other parts of the world as well. We have Professor Thompson here with us from the States. So this is, as I mentioned, another edition of our Catholic Civics webinar in the Beauty of Creation series. In September, we hosted Professor Chris Baglow on human uniqueness and evolution. And in October, Sister Damian Marie Savino on the environmental sciences and the link between an ecological way of thinking and health of all kinds, personal, social, political, and environmental. With us today, we have Jeff Woolard, who is the co-lead for the series with myself, Peter Copeland. Jeff is a PhD student at UBC currently in computer science. Before that, he was at U of T in Toronto here. I think he's got the better weather now, but I'm not envious.
Well, are you sure about that? Have you seen the floods?
Yeah, floods at present and rainy definitely as well in Vancouver. And Jeff is also a member of the Society of Catholic Scientists, which is a co-sponsor of this event. And we're very glad to have him here. So welcome, Jeff.
Good to be here.
And our guest tonight is Professor Christopher Thompson, who's a professor of moral theology at St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity, where he also serves the academic dean since 2006. He has written and lectured extensively on the subject of integral ecology, its place in the moral imagination, and its implications for theological appropriation of creation and the dignity of the human person. He also serves as a team mentor and formator on behalf of Catholic Rural Life, a national organization dedicated to the formation of rural pastoral leaders through professional and spiritual development. His book, The Joyful Mystery, outlines what he describes as a green Thomism, the integration of ecological attitudes and the spiritual tradition inspired by the medieval Saint Thomas Aquinas and the perennial philosophy. He is also one of the principal drafters of the Vocation of the Agricultural Leader, an international collaboration including global agricultural communities and the Vatican. So welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Very good. So I alluded to a couple of themes just at the outset there that we want to speak with you about tonight. So one of those being green Thomism and integral ecology, these ways of both viewing the world philosophically and integrating it, I guess you could say, with theology and ethics. Also want to speak with you about how we relate to the environment as persons today, especially, and then bring this to the social and political context as well, as that is what we are focused on here at Catholic Conscience. So, Professor, I'll dive right in. I want to start with a quote from one of your works, which outlines some themes of green Thomism and some of the ideas you're working with here, and get your thoughts on that. So, the goodness of created things, the purposive structure of created being, the inescapable embodied character of human existence, the capacity of reason to discern an order of creation, which is to be respected, the contemplative nature of human happiness, the importance of the virtuous life, the priority of the family, subsidiarity and sustainable practices, and the necessity of grace in achieving perfect, everlasting fulfillment in God in this life and beyond. There's a lot in there, Professor, but if you could unpack that for us, that
Wow,
would be
that's
great.
quite the list. I appreciate it. Maybe if I just, how about if I just back up and say so how we got into the conversation and a little bit of context of my study and my reading. It really began, like most insights with professors, with working with students, right? And I started to notice in my Catholic students, who were quite beautiful, excellent students, very faithful, very intellectually serious. They were just getting increasingly distanced from the natural order, and it made the teaching of poetry challenging. It made the teaching of art challenging because they wouldn't even know particularly the natural analogs. And then they maybe not even didn't know these things, but it didn't bother them that they didn't. They started to understand their Catholicism being a little bit more right of center, a little bit more conservative in their thinking, that somehow the Catholic conscience had no regard for, certainly not ecology, and not even really sort of things allied to the natural order. And it's not that they wouldn't engage in the material sciences, but the idea that somehow nature itself would be an object of consideration and contemplation, I think they were somewhat suspicious of this. Well, that struck me as increasingly stranger and stranger. And so I said, we're going to go on a field trip. And we went out to southwestern Minnesota, large, vast farms, to just sort of get away from the university setting. I'm in a very beautiful setting, but it's highly technologically saturated. So we need to get away. Mm-hmm. And then just being with the students and the kinds of questions they raised, I realized there was something was going on, that something was happening to the Catholic imagination, where the natural order was getting further and further removed from our Catholic life. And then I started to just explore, what did the church do with agricultural questions and land question? What does the church do with, we went out to farms in Southwest Minnesota. So I thought, well, I will just look up, Catholic agriculture. And I ran across this organization called Catholic Rural Life, 90 years old here in the United States. And they had, for decades, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, elaborate social conferences. In 1941, this is my benchmark, in Bismarck, North Dakota, 15,000 people showed up at the Catholic Rural Life Conference. Wow. Agronomists, farmers, biologists, liturgists, philosophers, theologians, 15,000 people at the annual conference in 1941 in Bismarck, North Dakota. I mean, holy smoke. I can't imagine 15,000 Catholics getting together on much of anything, much less care of land, stewardship of the farm, agricultural life in general. Well, that, of course, got my attention. And I started looking at Catholic Rock. Every year they had national conferences. At their peak, they had maybe 17,000, 20,000 members at their peak. And then I started to look at, well, what's going on in higher ed now? And my context is the United States. Of the 244 Catholic universities in the United States, not a single one offers a program in agriculture, not one. Agriculture is the largest, after the military, largest industry in the United States, bar none. It's the biggest chunk of our budgets, and it's the biggest chunk of our economic activity. And there is no Catholic university that's stepped into that space. I just thought this is odd. If you want to be an engineer, if you want to be a doctor, if you want to be a dentist, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be an artist, you want to be a real estate agent, you want to be a theologian, a philosopher, an English major, you want to be a computer scientist, we've got lots of programs. But if you want to learn how to tend a farm, if you want to learn how to coax from the soil a prudent yield, if you want to manage your resources in a way that contribute to the common good, if you want to learn all the complexities of the kinds of management that goes into complex operations, your farm might have actually been older than the university we actually established. Your family would have had it longer. If you wanted to enter into that thoughtfully, there was no Catholic university for you. So how do you go from 15,000 people engaging the question to the sort of flatland, the wasteland we have now? That's what prompted my inquiry. When all the boats are falling, it's not like the university went liberal and they dropped it, or they went conservative and they dropped. No, the whole conversation just evacuated. So that peaked. I just couldn't let that go. And so I started to study curricula in Catholic universities. And I started to watch what's happening to the required courses of your average Catholic student going through universities. And they went from a peak to about 18 courses in philosophy down to 1. And over time, you could see philosophy of nature was getting jettisoned from the curriculum. Philosophy of nature was getting the idea that there was an intellectual appropriation of the organic systems in front of us first, before there's any discussion of the human person. I'm going to assume the audience doesn't do a lot of reading in crusty, dusty Thomism, but if they did, they would know in the classic sort of Brennan textbooks of Thomistic psychology and in the intro to Thomistic thought, the first 200 pages were studying organisms and plants. All of the Thomistic ethical treatment and moral psychology of the human person all emerged from the philosophy of nature as a starting point. And what happened is this starts to shove off to the biological sciences. Meanwhile, we keep talking about the human person, but our relationship to the natural order gets severed. Now you're down to 1 course in the curriculum. They might call it philosophy of the human person. I doubt it. If they do still keep that language. And usually it's an elaborate discussion about the human person versus the computer. Are we machines or not? Now, that's not to say that's not an important question. But when you're creating generations of Catholic intellectuals where the primary concern is how to distinguish myself from the machine, you completely lose the embodied character of what it means to be a human being as formally organized and finally constituted. I like to think my project is a theology of the body from the belt up, is what I sometimes like to say. A lot of theology of the body is about the sexual life, and it's a beautiful discussion. It's a very powerful discussion, no question about it, but it tends to be belt down, right? It's talking about our capacity as sexual beings. I want a theology of the body that goes to the rest of the body, embodiment, a theology of embodiment, captures the best of the tradition and reconceives the dignity of the human person as an embodied being. It's been an absolute treat to think about the questions and teach about the questions. It's a little embarrassing because you feel like you're bringing people back to the most fundamental. Yes. I wish I had a very sophisticated discovery, but I'm afraid it's rather primitive to just say we're embodied creatures. That's not a curse for the human person. That's actually our dignity. And St. Thomas, I think, and of course there are others, but St. Thomas, I think, being a sort of premier Catholic intellectual, I don't think that's in question. He's the common coin of the realm in most of Catholic theological discourse, intellectual discourse. And he had developed an incredible portrait of the human person as this embodied creature with this immortal soul. And what had happened is that portrait of the person just was getting increasingly conceptualized. And I'll just say one more point, and then because I'm going to go on for days if you don't interrupt me. All right. Well, I'm just warming up here. So what happens is Catholicism becomes increasingly conceptual in its apparatus and its expression. By that, you get concerned that there's so much pressure on the newcomer, the young person, to keep an elaborate schema in their heads, in their imaginative world. Whose feast day is it? What are the liturgical colors? Who's on the winning team? Who's on the losing team? What do I do? Where do I stand? What do I say? And all of these characters and all of these figures elaborately in my head. Meanwhile, my ordinary embodied life looks absolutely indistinguishable from anybody else. Meanwhile, I eat the way everybody else eats. I shop the way everybody else eats. I live the way everybody else eats. And Catholicism starts to become this Pokemon game, this sort of sacred Pokemon game, this elaborate menagerie of characters. Well, no one can live under this burden. No one can live under the burden. And frankly, I think if we're going to have the re-evangelization of culture, you've got to recover the embodied character. That is what culture is. Culture is not an apparatus of intellectual ideas. It's the expression of those ideas in the material order. You don't have culture talking about art. You have culture when artists emerge. You don't have culture talking about music. You have culture when people pick up an instrument. You don't have culture talking about architecture. You have culture when people start to stack stones. Instruments, stones, art, bread, timber, and texture. That's culture. So if we're going to re-evangelize culture, very incarnation. If we're going to re-evangelize culture, we're going to have to get that embodiment back.
Yeah.
So I didn't mean to rant.
Did your student ever
question? So I'm sorry.
Did your student ever get the question, an answer to their question of what type of animal is the artichoke?
Oh yeah,
that has the artichoke heart. What type of animal is that?
Oh, I'll never forget it. There's a couple of teaching moments when you can feel the energy is completely drained out, and you realize, okay, all right.
I want to get right onto those, Professor, and I know Jeff is really in tune with experiential learning and bringing this into the more theoretical disciplines as well. So we'll get right to that. But before jumping in, I want to make sure we get some of those base terms.
Right.
Explicated.
I will. Keep me accountable, please.
Integral ecology. Explain that and some of the key principles in this. Ordered world in some of the thinking of St. Thomas.
Okay, let's start with basically green Thomism, since that was the language. That's a phrase that I've come up with to try to introduce the thought of St. Thomas and ecology, to build some bridges between conversations that have seemingly developed on disparate sets of terms. I think Catholics ought to be fully engaged in the ecological discussions, and I think we're actually, frankly, exceptionally equipped to engage thoughtfully in those conversations. So one effort was to bridge the kind of a gap that was emerging in Thomistic scholarship and in ecological scholarship. Interesting conversation as to how that's come about or why that seems to perpetuate. So the green Thomism was try to get Thomistic scholarship, Thomism being related to St. Thomas, and ecological discussions united on the same page. So that's green Thomism in a nutshell, is to try to get those conversations going. Integral ecology is, it actually, I don't know the history of the phrase. I think it comes out of a Vatican document. It's one of the earliest places I've seen it used prior to Laudato Si, but I think Pope Francis in Laudato Si came out in 2015. I think integral ecology started to hit mainstream. And what's integral ecology? Well, I understand it as the attempt to live a reasonable, thoughtful life as an embodied creature among embodied creatures. Integral ecology is the reflective habits required of a thoughtful, faithful Catholic who begins to discern in their lives a set of circumstances and responsibilities that are drawn into, not at odds with, their relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not at odds with their relationship with Jesus Christ. It's an expression of their relationship with Jesus. So to me, back to that sort of Pokemon world, you really want to be able to identify the Christian. How are they eating? How are they living? What does their home look like? Does it have a certain portrait of simplicity about it? Are they eating more simply on the food chain? Do they observe the fasts? Do they observe the feasts? Do they know when to, celebrate? Do they exhibit in their economic, in their embodied life, that they have discovered the person of Jesus, the Logos, the one through whom all things were made. And in discovering Jesus, they want to honor those things that are made. And so they conduct themselves in a way that's reflective and thoughtful. So when you go into a Catholic home, you really see their Catholicity in the kitchen. You really see their Catholicity at the dinner table, with the celebration of quality, the celebration of a thoughtful consumption, the celebration of a social consumption, the celebration of an integral consumption, feast days and fast days, and honoring of guests, and the celebration of foods, and the making of crafts, all these things that make human living embodiment just such a joy. That was our Catholic culture. That was our Catholic culture. Foods and music and dress and now I feel like it's getting reduced to an intellectual apparatus, a set of principles I have to maintain in my imaginative world but I tend not to embody. That's a little bit of a simplicity. But so integral ecology is an attempt to bring to the surface a set of practices that embody, and I'm assuming faithful Catholicism here, that embody among faithful Catholics this full participation of our celebration as rational creatures among a rationally ordered universe. One other quick little story, if I may, or do you want to? I've got
Well,
a little
just very
story.
briefly on that, Professor, I think it's spot on, and you've already alluded to how the term, it's supposed to mean, it's supposed to be expansive and integrating all of the different parts of you properly, so that you're really flourishing and with those around you. So it's being kind of straitjacketed and confined to too small a realm, and this is really drawing attention to the fact that
it's really unfortunate that on the Catholic side, now it's getting better, but on the Catholic side, the more faithful Catholic, I think we could say maybe more conservative Catholic, or they're identifying with a liturgical tradition. They tend to get neuralgic around ecological issues. That's a liberal concern. That's not our. That's really too bad. That's really unfortunate. There's so much that could be gained from learning and entering in those conversations. And then on the ecological side, Roman Catholics, they're Neanderthals, they're anti-science, blah, blah, blah. It's really unfortunate. And until we get in my opinion, thanks God for God and thank God for the gospel, right? We're going to bring the gospel to these conversations in order to energize both sides, to have a richer appropriation of what it means to live as a Catholic, and to have a richer appropriation of the horizons that the questions of ecology open up. Without a supernatural objective, the questions of ecology is just another form of totalitarianism. I'm afraid that's where we're going to go.
Okay, so speaking of, thanks be to God for Jesus Christ. What does it mean to propose Christ as the Logos, as the Alpha and the Omega, where that unites, origin and finality, creation and death?
Okay, I have to contain myself. Well, I'm going to sit like this.
Just throwing some gasoline on the fire.
Absolutely.
Let's go.
I know you guys are being almost abusive here. I'll crash in about 15 minutes here. This is the profound message of Jesus Christ. When Paul goes out into the Areopagus, he says, look, I see you've got other gods. I see you've even got altars to no-name gods. Let me tell you about the Creator. In him we move and have our being. He opens with a gesture of saying, you sense that there's a God at work in creation. Let me tell you about that God at work in creation. So the ground is prepared for the gift of Jesus Christ. Christ doesn't come into an atheist context. He comes into a highly religious context, a religious consciousness. And a key component of that religious consciousness was the presence of God in the created order. In Psalm 8, when I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you have made, what is man that you are mindful of him? There was an inescapable question about the beauty of cosmos and the question of man. That was inescapably yoked across the ancient traditions. This is the great Greek tradition reflecting on cosmos and the Kalan. They discerned in the cosmos a wisdom at work. The Logos is the principle, the second person of the Trinity, the ratio, the word, if you will, veiled in the created order. So when we profess Jesus Christ, we profess him as the Logos incarnate. And I think that's just this beautiful moment that all of a sudden yokes, inescapably yokes, the salvific redemption of Jesus Christ and the splendor of the created order. That was the trajectory. God's came down all the time. You remember in Acts, they suspect that the disciples are Hermes, and they start worshiping Peter as if he's a god. Well, no, stop that. Don't do that. They were prepared for gods to come down. That was not quite earth-shattering that you and I might take it to be. But which God was enfleshed in Jesus Christ? Is he Hermes? Is he Zeus? Is he Apollo? Maybe Hera? No, he's the Logos. He's the Word, the one through whom all things were made. You get in this beautiful prologue of the Gospel of John, the distillation of the core of the kerygma. In the cosmos, in the splendor of things, you and I discern an ordered universe. The principle behind that ordered universe turns out to be a who and not a what. The principle of that ordered universe, that urge for praise, that urge for dialogue, that urge for worship, that urge to give back, that lies at the heart of every culture when they encounter the splendor of cosmos, is finally expressed in this figure and person of Jesus Christ. Holy smokes. Now all of a sudden, you're telling me that when I'm looking at the starry heavens and I have this urge to worship, this urge now gives shape. It's been given shape. It gives direction, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that's something technology can never give. Technology is not a face. Technology is not a person. Technology can't challenge me, can't know me, can't love me.
I would totally agree. And the increasing technologization of our experience of the natural world is going to be a special challenge for Catholics. Special challenge, frankly, for the human being who's made for worship, who's made for wonder, who's made for cosmos. We're not the first people to discover the splendor of the universe. We are key to our kerygma is its beauty. I will say there are rival attitudes towards the cosmos, and many, many, many attitudes is one of total dread. When they look out into the cosmos, they're scared to death. We're going to get wiped out. We need to go find someone to throw in a volcano. We need to go sacrifice someone. We got to find the goat. We've got to find someone to kill in order to appease these vengeful gods. The Christians didn't emerge out of that kind of approach. We said, no, at the heart of the cosmos is splendor, is beauty, not violence, right? So many of the cosmogonic rival myths come out of violence. How does the world emerge? It emerges out of strife, Heraclitean strife, or cosmogonic battles going on in the Babylonian myths or in the Manichaean myths.
Well, and the modern myths of Marvel superhero movies.
Well, that's right. You get a sort of modern iteration of that.
Yeah.
And speaking of modern myths, I think if I had I've got plenty of anxieties, but given this topic, I would say global warming has a kind of new Gnostic element to it. Not that it isn't a concern, not that we don't have to address, not that we don't have to adjust, but we want to be very careful that we do not create a subtle myth that somehow the natural order is ultimately against us. Somehow the cosmos is opposed to us. That's Gnosticism. That was the great Gnostic position, to make you suspicious of nature, come to despise nature, come to resent nature. And so magic gets introduced as a means of controlling nature, manipulating nature. You get the emergence of power over nature in technology with its new kind of magical promise that with enough money, enough resources, we can beat the tar out of nature. That's not a particularly Christian or Catholic disposition.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, we should respect. I mean, I enjoy a hot summer day and soaking up the sun, especially in these. The sun's already set where I am. It's only 4:30, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to cover up and put my SPF on. So I'm going to get totally roasted. Right. It's respect for brother sun.
Right, I would agree. A certain posture before the created order that elicits something of wonder, of mystery, of gift, of humility, and frankly, joy. It's kind of a lot of neat stuff out there too. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to be a human being. Never aspire to be an angel. That's not a good thing for us. You want to be careful about that. All right. So let's see. I would just say, in rediscovering, if I were to summarize the kind of the whole project, it'd be nice if people got excited about Thomas and all that. That'd be great. But really, I want to reignite in a person the invitation that Christ extends to us as the Logos and as the Logos enfleshed. Reignite the invitation that's available to each and every human being as they encounter beauty in the natural order. And really step into that space and begin to see the beautiful sunset that you appreciated tonight, or the dawn that you appreciate the next morning, or the flower, any moments of those beauty and see those as prompts, see them as invitations. Awe, the experience of awe before the beauty of the created order. I have been blessed to speak on the topic all over the world, from Zambian farmers, French organic farmers, mega farmers in California, almond growers in the San Joaquin Valley. I have been down in Texas and in Maine and in Alaska and in Crete and in Scotland and in Milan and in Rome, from the biggest corporate farms to the half-acre indigenous farmer. And I always start with the experience of awe before the splendor of creation.
Mhm.
And no one ever says, I don't know what you mean. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
In the human person is this encounter with the splendor of cosmos,
Mhm.
with the splendor and beauty of creation. In my mind, that's a prelapsarian glimpse into the human condition. And it really is a glimpse. If you've ever been, for us in the United States, it's the Rocky Mountains. You go out to the Central Ranges, you go out to British Columbia, you go to Banff, you go to these places that are just spectacular. And you have this sense of awe. I've tried it everywhere. I've never had anyone anywhere say, I don't know what you mean. It
Mhm.
just fascinates me. That tells me that there's something in the human condition that is vulnerable to the splendor of cosmos. And it's this glimpse, it's this fleeting experience. It's hard to capture. Everyone, of course, grabs their phone and we're going to take our phone out and we're going to, and it's a disaster. Or your buddy comes up and says, wow, isn't that beautiful? And you say, well, it was until you started talking, right? There's a certain silence, there's a certain adoration, there's a certain awe, there's a certain mystery. In my mind, that's a prelapsarian glimpse. We get just a glimpse of what Adam and Eve knew prior to the fall, just a glimpse, a little prelapse. John Paul II says that married couples in their chaste love, in their ecstasis of their marital love, they get a prelapsarian glimpse of the union and the freedom and the love of each other. There's a little glimpse, the joy of the marital bond, right? Well, heck, if you can have it there, I don't see why we can't have it at the top of the mountain.
Absolutely. For so much you've said there, it really makes me think of it's difficult. We all catch these glimpses, as you say, but it's very easy to take an approach to life that is fearful of death.
Yeah.
One of not seeing it, as a part of the natural life cycle. One that sees nature as a standing reserve of things to be extracted for ourselves. Not something necessarily to relate to. I think actually, without the religious horizon, nature looks pretty grim actually. It's if we would like to romanticize about but there's a lot of death and killing. But so I want to ask you about this problem of evil, which we've discussed in previous discussion with Professor Baglow, and help us get around this, distinguishing physical evil from moral evil.
I'll try.
We're preoccupied with avoiding many things that we take to be evil. As I mentioned, death, ignorance, attachments to things that are unhealthy. How should we think about these issues in an environmental context, as you've been discussing?
Well, I'm going to presume listeners are familiar with the theology of the fall, and we're not going to have to reintroduce the basic Christian narratives of the prelapsarian state. That's a $10 word for Adam and Eve prior to the fall, and then after the fall. Because one of the challenges, again, in sort of Catholic thought, is we've sort of lost the significance of that shift, and that shift is quite important in terms of understanding what it means to be a human being. Let me begin just by saying, in the prelapsarian state, right, the theology is that Adam and Eve enjoy a certain integrity of body, impassibility, they enjoy immortality, because they've been given what are called these preternatural gifts. Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but that's what the preternatural gifts were given. And it was basically a kind of a supernatural insurance policy against the vagaries of nature. If they didn't have those supernatural gifts, then Adam and Eve were essentially like any other animal. And guess what animals do? They die. They're given their preternatural gifts of immortality, immune from death, impassibility, no suffering, integrity. Their interior life was well ordered. And I would add some kind of integral ecology. They were able to discern the logos and things. After the fall, they lose those. And so now you've got the human condition vulnerable to death, vulnerable to suffering, vulnerable to the difficulties of earth and coaxing the earth in terms of its production. Why is that important? Well, because you notice what I didn't mention in the drama, and that is the order of lower creation. If I had a bumper sticker, this would be it. Lower creation is not directly implicated in the fall. Lower creation, I mean the non-rational animals, if you'll allow me the distinction, non-rational animals, plants, organic substances, they are not directly implicated in the fall. One of the things that's happened in the Catholic imagination is we have scooped the whole cosmos into the drama of sin and redemption. And now bugs and bunnies and bees are caught up in the fall. And in the prelapsarian state, because there was no sin, that would mean bugs and bunnies and bees didn't die because sin introduced death. And we know that's bad. And so these would not die. Aquinas goes after the question. He says, that's just totally absurd. It's totally absurd. Omni no rationabile. That's nuts in the Latin, right? He's pretty unnuanced in his condemnation of the position. He says it's in the nature of the lion to be a carnivore, and you can't be a carnivore without the carne, right? And even and some will propose in the tradition, to be fair, and some will propose subsequently that somehow in the prelapsarian state there would be no carnivorous activity, no animals would die. Aquinas says no, that's part of the provident arrangement of things. Well, that's kind of a shock. I will say, if I ever get anybody kind of blowing up at me, that's where it happens. When I start to say that lower creation is not caught up in the problem of sin. The coming to be and passing away of creatures is part of the provident arrangement of things. It's just splendor. Part of the beauty of the cosmos is its fragility. Part of the beauty of the cosmos is precisely its movement. Part of the beauty of the symphony is the silence that sometimes comes among the instruments. What kind of symphony would it be if every instrument played the whole time? Well, no, what makes the symphony beautiful is that the flutes are playing now, and in 4 measures, they will stop. The coming to be and the passing away of things, the toto of the universe, is part of God's provident arrangement. That is not directly implicated in the fall. Original sin only influences the intellectual creatures. That's the angelic realms, which we won't talk about tonight, but if you want to, we could, and the human being, insofar as we have intellect will. Those are the only ranks and orders of being that are influenced by sin. So now, here I am, fallen. I walk out into an ordered cosmos. I walk out into a divine work of art. That's what Aquinas says. Aquinas says creatures are divine works of art. Aquinas says they're not, the nature of animals was not changed by man's sin, explicitly. So you and I now are walking out into the divine jeweler's shop. You and I are walking out into our Father's house. If you want to know what was the cosmos like in Adam and Eve, this is what the cosmos was like. And what a glorious cosmos it is. They're not caught up in darkness. I am. Mm-hmm. I'm fraught with darkness and ignorance. They are brimming with light, thick with light, gushing with light, pregnant with meaning. It's why the cosmos continues to be so interesting even after all these years of study. It's because the depth of the creature is so rich with light, because it's been willed into being by a supreme God who loves, and he grants the creature its own proper essay, and it radiates this intelligibility. And it's so bright, it takes us years and years to grasp the nature and essence of a single tree or a single fly. This is the splendor of ecology. Ecology lives off of that aquifer of creation. Ecology draws off that splendor of creation. One of the things I love about the ecological movement is you don't have to persuade them about awe before the created order. They just take that as their starting point. The ecologists and the Thomists share this much in common, that it's better to be than not to be. that the fragmentation and the splendor of the universe is part of its glory. That in fact, we've lost something when we lost a species. We've lost something of the richness of the divine splendor. Now, they won't necessarily say divine splendor, but we've lost something when we lost a species. Okay, back to evil. So the question of human evil and we have to start sorting out between animal death, animal suffering, and human suffering. I hate to say it, but their death is part of the provident arrangement. It's the coming to be and passing away. My death, on the other hand, is a feature of original sin. All right, it's just a quality of original sin. That in itself, all of a sudden, in my mind, enriches the discussions of human evil, evil in the physical order, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to catch my breath and I'll let you guys.
No, just,
Yeah, well, let me, while you're catching your breath, let me read a little excerpt. I'd like to take it maybe a bit more concrete, and
Sure.
After I read this, you could share some anecdotes from your family trip to Churchill, Manitoba. So, okay, this is from Discerning the Natural Law.
Yeah.
An azure dome is stretched taut to the bursting point. A roseate hue hangs like incense over the nave of the earth. Vespers is about to begin. God, come to my assistance. And as the choral procession begins, 1,000 gray-cloaked sandhill cranes settle into their stalls within the grassy marsh, chanting their familiar praises of evensong. So this was when you were in the
Crex Meadows. Yeah, I'm going to get weepy if I call it too, Rich. I'll never forget it. I will never forget it. I just
want to see, creation like that. I want to experience nature like that. I want to be embodied in creation like that. And maybe with the audience, you can share how you see and how you feel when you're in nature.
I better not. No, I may make a fool of myself if I did that. There's some conversations that are only for Mrs. Thompson, right? Yeah, she has to put up with all of it, but the rest of you guys get the public version, right? No, I seriously be told. Well, you can see in that passage, I'm playing off liturgy and creation. I'm playing off, Vespers and evening prayer and the cranes settling into their stalls and the monks and the cranes and all of us are settling into evening prayer and the whole cosmos is settling into evening prayer. The whole cosmos is getting caught up in this fantastic praise of God, the creator. And the crane will make its best effort. And the beautiful thing about the crane is it's not caught up in the drama of sin. Now, we've got to be careful here. It means that the crane is just splendid in its crane-like ways. The crane is just glorious in its crane, and it's giving its best to be the best crane it can be. And that's the splendor of the crane. I too long to give the best I can be. I too desire, and sometimes I have to say I'm jealous of the cranes, how they live such well-ordered, balanced lives. Me, I fly around like a broken bat, right? And they are so ordered and peaceful in their lives, and I am so frantic in mine. That's because I'm caught up in sin. They're not. And so, but all of us are not immune from this great lure of love on the part of the Creator, who lifts from the no of all nothingness the great splendor of being. In the generosity of God and his creativeness, he lures from nothingness the splendor of this cosmos, including the splendor of me. And I'm not an exception of this general rule of the being and generosity of God. So I look at the crane and I marvel at the crane and I say, oh, if only I could live one day like a crane, so integral, so ordered, so balanced, so peaceful. And yet, so I was talking to my, just at home, and my son comes in, he says, now, Dad, are you saying Cookie, our dog, is better off than Mother Teresa? He's like 7 years old. He says, are you saying my dog is better off than Mother Teresa? I said, from the point of view of creation, no. From the point of view of redemption, yes. From the point of view of creation, the crane, the dog, the tree, they just get to live the glory of God to the best of their little limited abilities, and it's a wonderful thing. From the perspective of redemption, they're not caught up in the drama of sin. So my destiny is greater. So we can marvel at the crane, but we don't want to envy them. We can marvel and accompany the crane in their splendor. We can care for the crane in their splendor. We can enter into the care of the cranes and the cosmos and all of its splendor and cheer them on as they disclose the generosity of God in their being, but never forget that my destiny is so much richer because I'm called into a redemptive friendship with the maker of it all. And the crane is not.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah, and this makes sense with what the poet Wendell Berry, in one of his Sabbath poems, has a line, the trees and the creatures of the forest, they aren't confused with who they are.
Yeah, no.
But I am.
Yeah, right. They're caught up in I'm caught up in the drama of the sin. They're not. And just to
Yeah, and in some sense, like we also need to use things get frustrated in their purpose when we don't use them and bring them up maybe into the liturgy and into our drama, and that glorifies them. Actually, it doesn't denigrate them.
It does, pulling a little bit from Bonaventure there, that part of their dignity is the elevation of the creature contemplated. That's like this creature supercharged now.
This is a perfect transition, Professor, to talk even more, in depth about how we do this, how we bring this into our lives.
Right.
So I think obviously you've done a great job illustrating how sometimes, it's really our intellect that obviously differentiate us and offer us, great gifts to enter into the life of God. And it's also our downfall. And one of the things I think you're alluding to is that we need to bring our heart more in line with our intellect and especially become attuned to the nature of things. So how do we see rightly and bring contemplation, greater awareness of the splendor and beauty and order in the world today, especially in light of some of the things you've mentioned, our urban disconnectedness from nature, omnipresence of technology. I've got devices all around me here, and how do we address some of those things?
First thing you have to do is go to a reconciliation. The first step in becoming a green Thomist is to enter into, and you shouldn't walk, you should run. You should run to the sacrament of reconciliation. And because if you're going to welcome the divine guest, you want to tidy up. Anytime the doorbell rings and a special guest is arriving, that's when you grab the newspapers and straighten them up, and you bring your coffee cup to the sink and you shove your socks under the chair. Well, if you're going to welcome the divine guest, you've got to look interiorly and just do some house cleaning. If you've got some heavy bleeders, if you've got major sin weighing you down, there's no way no wonder you're not enjoying creation, because there's this huge awkward topic that neither of you want to talk about, and you've got this wound in this relationship. So I'm not going to be inclined to prayer because I don't want to talk to the guy right now. I'm kind of mad, or I think he's mad at me. So the first thing you got to do is, I be somewhat flip and I want to be lighthearted about it, but it's absolutely critical. The first thing you do is you go to the sacrament of reconciliation. And if for some people that's threatening or scary or, overwhelming, just pick a few things. Everybody's got some places that they can tidy up. The point is, the freer I am in the conversation, I have to be free in the conversation. I have to just be docile to the presence of another, presuming they have some inklings of faith. But they might not. They might have just an inkling of the splendor of creation. Step into that experience and enter into a dialogue and begin to suspect, is it possible that I'm being drawn to something more than this? Is it possible that there's something more to life? This is frankly, the painful thing about ecology is, without that supernatural outlook, oh my gosh, what a life of suffering. You dedicate yourself to the preservation of the species, and you find one, and on the evening news we're going to release it, and out it flies, and sure enough the bigger version of the thing snatches it and eats it before the news cycle is. Well, what do I do now? It's obvious that nature doesn't really care about not just species, but whole phylum, whole kingdoms. There was a time when there were no mammals on the earth. None. Okay, we're going to say, gosh, that was a disaster? No, I think we're going to say nature seems to have worked it out. Natura is a principle of becoming. It's a principle of movement. It's a principle of motion. In truth, but in fact, nature now has become this principle of stasis. It's become this principle of control and maintenance. no fluctuation. So we're going to go in, we're going to suppress all the fires because we know fires are really bad. We're going to put all this energy into suppressing fires, only to discover 150 years of fire suppression creates a very unhealthy forest. In fact, it's a good thing when the fires come through and clean out the dead wood. And our initial vision is, no, that's tragic. Anyway, my point is to say, natura is a principle of movement and it's a principle of motion. So when we are entering into, if I'm coming from the ecological side of things, I think the problem of death just looms large there. I think it just looms large. What I would do if I were on the verge of despair as an ecologist, I would begin to say, maybe there's more to it than just this particular species. Maybe my instinct to preserve the creature is in fact sound, but it isn't because of this particular creature. And it isn't even because of this arrangement of creatures, because I know that my best efforts are it's going to change. Maybe what I'm being drawn into is a creator, not the creature. Maybe what I really love when I love the creatures is the creator. And they start to introduce a relationship. Now I'm assuming that's not the Catholic. I kind of mixed my characters here. If I'm coming from the ecologist side and I'm utterly secularized and maybe not even catechized, the door into a relationship with God could be through the contemplation of the fragility and beauty of things. From the Catholic side, if you're catechized, go to reconciliation as soon as possible, plug the heavy bleeders, do some house cleaning, enter into a dialogue, and allow the created order, allow the Father to set the menu, allow him to let you lie down in green pastures, allow the Father to come and present a splendor. And sometimes in my prayer, all I do is start prayer with the phrase, it's all so beautiful, it's all so beautiful, it's all so beautiful, it's all so beautiful. Because beauty is one of the doors. Truth, beauty, goodness. It's all so beautiful. And you work on, take an inventory of the situation I find myself in. What's beautiful in this particular space I'm in? The quality of the light, the quality of that green and the freshness of that plant, the quality. What am I doing? I'm just prepping the soul, dilating the soul, allowing the soul to relax, to begin to take in the beauty of the splendor of things.
That's much more inspiring than it's also difficult. It's also painful. It's also
it's also difficult. It's also painful because that's also true. But you got to, you'll be defeated.
The prayer of thanksgiving, or the prayer of complaining.
Right. You start with a prayer. Narcisa Irala, Jesuit spiritual director, he talks about practicing what he calls conscious sensations, where you really take inventory through the senses of the circumstances. And part of his thesis is because created things are thick with light. And that is, in fact, the splendor that he sets out in front of us. God seeks to renew us through the splendor of creation. So taking time to contemplate its beauty, taking time to contemplate its splendor is actually one of the spiritual strategies to be able to get you focused. One other piece before I forget it. For a lot of people, the image of wisdom is me carrying a candle and I'm walking out into the dark universe, and here I am with the light of wisdom, and I'm walking along. You often use a candle as to show the themes of wisdom, and I'm walking, and as I go this way, now this gets illuminated, and I go over here, and this gets illuminated. For St. Thomas, it's just the opposite. Things are brimming with light. I'm in the dark. It's the thing that's so splendid, so rich, so bright. What makes learning so difficult is they're so bright, it takes me patience and labor and docility to allow the intelligibility of the thing to speak. And what you're doing in liberal arts training is I'm allowing the bottom of the beaker to say something to me. And so I'm training myself in the habits of science so that the scientific intelligibility of the thing comes available. And music appreciation, I'm allowing my soul to be docile to the sounds. And so the intelligibility of the sound begins to feed my soul. The intelligibility of the light begins to feed my soul in art. The intelligibility of the structure begins to feed my soul in architecture. The intelligibility of the written page begins to feed my soul through English literature. What am I doing when I take art and literature and music and history? I'm exercising the muscles of the soul to be able to drink in truth wherever it's found, wherever it's going to be found. That's how the one becomes an apprentice in this great cosmos of God's generosity and being. I'm sorry, but
That's lovely. It's
just
lovely.
fantastic. I say thank God for God all the time, thank God for God. It's just a beautiful thing. Then you get to the problems of sin in my own fractured life, the problems of death in my own fractured life. But Aquinas will explicitly say that from the perspective of my animality, insofar as I'm an animal, and he has no doubts about animals, right? He says if it isn't an animal, it's not a man. He is not afraid of animality, our animality. From the perspective of my animality, death it's built in. That's what animals do. They croak. But from the perspective of my immortal soul, death begins to be painful. So I am this unique animal that has this immortal soul as the principle of unity of my animal operations. And that is clearly an unusual phenomenon in the created order. And so the human soul in the prelapsarian state gets those preternatural gifts precisely to begin to address that discrepancy. I have this immortal soul that has this horizon of infinite interest, and I'm yoked to this animal body that's caught up in the life of decay and change. So I get the preternatural gifts, and I'm lifted into this condition. After original sin, I am still immortal in my soul. I still have immortal life. I still have these immortal aspirations. I still long for the infinite. I still long for the eternal truths and the everlasting goodness. But now I'm stuck in this body that's caught up in the logic of organisms, death and decay and suffering, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you've given us so many rich depictions of the disposition and the attitude and the concepts we need to bring to cultivating this in our lives. I want to focus on some ways in which this
you're going to call me back a third time, aren't you? Saying practically,
I have to keep coming back. You laid the ground so well, and now we're misbehaving.
So how do we do it? In other words, I'm not sure. Let me just throw some things out there and see if that's useful to you.
I'll give you a few examples. You've mentioned, urban disconnectedness. This dominating, controlling attitude that we have that really closes ourselves off. I think much of our work lives across the spectrum are dominated, for lack of a better word, by this attitude. What are these contemporary trends you're seeing, and how do people invite this gratitude?
Yeah, if I'm hesitant, it's because I don't really want to privilege any particular form of life. The fact is, I trust Providence that he puts us in the circumstances he finds myself in. And I don't want to create any fictions in Catholic consciences that say, oh, if I were only out in the woods, then I'd be a saint. That's the evil one talking. Yeah, you don't want to, I don't want to promote that. So even in my urban settings, I think a habit of contemplation has to be intentional there. I first step would be going to reconciliation to just get your soul at peace. The second steps would be creating prayer space and time in your day. In my opinion, as a beginner and as a perpetual beginner, I think you should at least begin outside. I know for a long time, I felt almost guilty about being outside. I noticed when I was outside, my conversations with God were rich. And when I was in the chapel, I was always complaining about the bench, and I was always complaining about the flickering light. And there was a cold there. And I thought the tabernacle was gaudy, and darn that microphone, they haven't fixed it again. And, and I am a bundle of just resentment.
Well, I just get sleepy.
Yeah, well, we all have our strategies, huh? But I found that when I would just get away out into even the smallest of green spaces, my conversations would, now that probably tells you more about my own sinful state than anything, I don't know. But as a beginner, I would go, the best place to pray is wherever prayer happens. Don't let anyone say, well, no, you really should be praying and such and such. I really resent that rhetoric. The best place to pray is wherever prayer happens. The fact is, the Lord is constantly inviting us into this friendship. The Lord is constantly inviting us into this relationship. And you and I, we get all bundled up and wound up and tense and everything. And we miss the conversations. We miss the invitations. We miss the little calm down, be still, I've got this. We miss the little moments of, I'm God. I've got this. I can do this. I'm a provident Father that loves you. I'm a provident Father that doesn't seek your perfection. I seek relationship. And God is this crazy lover that just keeps texting us every day. It's like, oh my Lord, would you just give me He's not going to let us alone. And he texts us with the created order. He texts us with the creatures. And I have to put myself in a habit of being docile to those things. 1 would be go to confession. 2 would be find places to pray. 3 would be begin to reconceive what's happening when you discern something beautiful. Really begin, and I don't care what it is, any moment of beauty you can begin to see as an invitation of the Logos, any moment of beauty as a disclosure of the Logos. And you can either remember this in prayer later in the day. I recollect all those occasions of beauty, this particular light or this particular flower or this particular symphony or this particular delicious lunch. When I begin to recollect occasions of beauty, thank him for occasions of beauty, draw it. When was I responsive to those occasions of beauty? When did I move from the experience of beauty to the laudatory and the praise? When did I move from the splendor of beauty into a Eucharistic prayer? And was I impelled in the end to go to the Eucharistic table? Is that the movement that's going on in my heart? So to me, the beautiful thing about the Eucharist, every culture tries to get right with God. Every culture says, oh, we've got a God, look at the cosmos, there's obviously God, we got to do something. And they smoke something, or they do something, or they slash or burn, or, they do something. Christians are no exception, except we think what we do is what God himself asked us to do. We have a little bit of advantage, we think, because Jesus didn't say, now I'd like you to worship me and see what you come up with. He says, no, this is how I want you to worship. This is how I want you to offer thanksgiving. Take this bread, take this wine. And when you pray these prayers, you'll get right with God. So for generations, he's been drawing people to himself so that the perfect offering may be made. Across the centuries, across the millennia, God has been drawing man to himself so that the perfect offering may be made. And in the Eucharistic celebration, that perfect offering is made. So how do we do this? Reconciliation, contemplative prayer, docility to beauty, affirming the movement to the Eucharistic sacrifice. The best definition of the integral ecological life is authentically participating in the Eucharist. When I authentically, fully, to the best of my abilities, with all of my weaknesses, participate in the Eucharist, that's when I'm living the integrally ecological life. That's when you've nailed it. So I do a lot of work.
So where is the cross in all of this?
The cross is the arduous way of self-abnegation, the arduous way of suffering that is the inescapable consequence of original sin. If I'm giving you anything, I'm giving you material for that process, to not lose hope, to take on the human condition of sin, to take on the human condition of suffering and unite, not escape it, not dread it, not hate it, not fear it, not resent it, but see that it's part of the condition of our brokenness that Christ himself has united
to
us
just
to.
fully embrace giving, fully embrace experiencing life as it is and learning through the uncertainty and the difficulties and the trials and tribulations and the ups and downs.
Mhm.
And once you bring in the preternatural gifts and you see that suffering is a consequence of original sin, well, now I can yoke my endurance of suffering, my praying through suffering, my praying in suffering. I can yoke this with redeeming and healing the mystical body of Christ, to restoring once again that original union that God intended. So I might not be unencumbered by suffering and disease, but that occasion of suffering and disease can actually enrich my prayer, because out of that suffering and disease, I now unite myself to the suffering of Christ and to the restoration of the mystical body as part of the plan. That's the great theology of suffering, was to unite ourselves to such things, not to flee but
Yeah.
to begin to see them as paths towards a deeper interior relationship with Christ. Now that's easier said than done, and I hesitate to say much more lest I sound flip.
Okay, I have a toughie.
Yeah, great.
So let's contrast how Christianity, how we treat, integral ecology and ecology with, let's say, Marxism, or with indigenous worldviews, either pre-Christian or post-Christian contact.
Yeah. Well, that's a big one. That's a bit of a toughie. I think if, at the risk of being, eventually demonstrated to be completely wrong, I'm beginning to think that ecology itself is a Christian theistic remnant. The fact of the matter is, let's start with indigenous. The fact of the matter is, while many, many, many cultures recognize the presence of the divine in the created order, it's not necessarily a good thing. That there's caprice there. There is cunning there. There is appeasement that has to happen. Well, that's not the Christian position of cosmos. That the core of the Christian conviction is being and goodness are convertible. That the goodness of things and the being of things are two facets of the same reality because of a God who supremely loves. Well, not every religious tradition, and when I say indigenous, I don't necessarily mean native, I mean indigenous around the globe. Manichees.
Yeah, there's indigenous European.
That's right. There are Manicheans. At one point, they would have been indigenous, right? The fact is, it's the Christian faith that proposes that God is this communio personarum of Trinitarian love. That's nothing to belittle or take for granted. In other words, most, frankly, the atheists, we'll set aside Marx for a moment, but the Marxist atheists, they're the exception. My seminarians always say, well, Dr. Thompson, if I'm in the jungle and I run into an atheist, what should I do? If you're in a jungle and you run into an atheist, that means the Starbucks is right around the corner. There are no atheists in the jungle. You got to be kidding me. Atheism is a modern conception where, that emerges out of the salons of Starbucks and Caribou. The only atheism is only feasible in a highly technologically saturated world where the grid is up and running. When you're in the jungle and you're running for your life and scraping things, and then all of a sudden theism becomes a real possibility because you see the presence and generosity of creation and the creator just right in front of your face. So, but I digress. So you talk about indigenous communities. I guess what I would say is there's much to glean that's positive because of the presence of the divine, but we want to be a little careful. Not all of the divines that are present in these traditions are the Christian divine. There's caprice. There's dread, frankly. So an indigenous population or indigenous community might have a sense of God present in the created order, but it's not always a question of love. It's not always a question of graciousness and the kind of God that's disclosed in the person of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. So I begin to think that I'm beginning to wonder if ecology itself isn't one of those remnants of a Christian theism that at its core suspects that being and goodness are convertible, that at its core suspects that the created order is in fact the fruit of an utterly generous God. Mm-hmm. If my cosmology, if my theology says that the world exists because of violence, well, then ecology, it seems to me, is not necessarily a theologically astute position. Mm-hmm. It's only in the Christian theistic tradition, where in the Christian Judeo tradition, where you get the generosity and goodness of God, and in the theology of creation, that ecological consciousness starts to emerge. Now, that's a little bit of a controversial claim. That's not to say other populations aren't keenly attuned to the value of creatures and the value of creation, but that's a little different than the Christian nuance about the splendor of being in toto. Very different posture before ourselves and the created order. And in Marxist atheist landscapes, well, the created order is simply material to be used. There's no theophany there at all. It's just simply to be exploited. Mm-hmm. This is where I said, with the emergence and the sort of new Gnosticism around global warming. We want to be a little careful that we don't trade in our desire to sort of take care of things. We don't inadvertently embrace a new kind of atheist ideology that sees nature as merely something to be commodified or controlled.
Mhm.
We want to be very careful about that.
Yeah. Well, this is another perfect segue. You've already mentioned at the outset how, ecological and environmental thinking, it's fallen away from the center of Catholic thinking, and how conservatively minded people are kind of wrongfully ignoring this part of of life. And this is a
And
natural
literally
thing.
minded people are wrongfully ignoring other things, but that's another evening.
This
I
is
just want to
so
spread it around,
absolutely,
not
it's
pick on my-
natural
Yeah,
for
yeah,
us
yeah,
to
yeah,
engage in ideological
yeah,
thinking and
right.
simplify things. So, one of the things we do here at Catholic Conscience is bring the principles of Catholic social teaching into our lives as citizens. And I think one of the things that it teaches us unquestionably is that reality is complex, and
Yeah.
ideological ways of viewing the world are clearly missing the whole picture. And so you just alluded to it there. One area where this kind of thinking comes through is in the relationship between environmental concerns and support for human life in the political and social world. So, people who have, say, this organic understanding of human nature, or pro-life views, commercially and socially, they seem to lack common ground with those who have an equally organic view of the natural world, when these views are perhaps not so naturally in tension, especially given the communism theme. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, whether there's a inconsistency there. How do these things relate?
There's an unfortunate inconsistency and it'd be wonderful if the ecologists and the pro-life movement would get together on the same table and celebrate the generosity of being, the generosity of God present in the structure of things. It seems to me.
Well, isn't that what integral ecology really means?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The way I put it,
So-
whether it's the garden bed or the marriage bed, the same provident God is at work, the same generosity and the kind of respect. And it's kind of an unusual set of circumstances because, the ecological movement calls us to a reform of lifestyle, calls us to a certain personal temperance, calls us to a simplicity of life, calls us. Well, the church is inviting the same thing in terms of the respect of the child and the respect of family. Ironically, it seems to me that there's sometimes a blind spot where people who are hyper vigilant at what happens in their table, they're totally indifferent in what happens in the bedroom. They're hyper vigilant about what's happening in their bodies in certain aspects, but utterly indifferent and caught up in the technological solutions elsewhere in their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
The beautiful vision of natural family planning, where the rhythms of fertility in the body become the norms that help guide consciences and how they conduct themselves in their responsible parenting. That's just participating in the natural law. I'm a rational creature as an embodied creature, and I participate in the natural law. And I'd love it if the two sides, those communities, could get together and begin to celebrate a holistic expression and celebration of the body and all of its splendor. That's probably still a ways out, but I don't.
I have big plans. I have big plans for outreach to, as a scientist, as a Catholic scientist, outreach to pro-life advocates and helping train and helping open them up to a new Mediterranean of big picture. Yeah.
Well, amen. I will pray for your success. We'll see. We have to stay hopeful. Back on the questions of ways, because I feel like you guys were constantly wanting me to. I wasn't sure what direction you wanted to go. Eating lower on the food chain. I think getting intentional about what you're eating. The dinner table is one of the most powerful places of evangelization. It's beginning in the home. How are you eating? What are you eating? What are the foods prepared? How are they prepared? Where did you get the foods? Now you might say, well, that's the luxury of the bourgeois, the yuppie who can sort of tootle around and drop a bunch of money on highly selected foods. And there's no question I've been blessed with a good job and have access to all kinds of quality things. There's no escaping the truth of that. But really what I would do is introduce what I would say is something like a principle of tithing. Just maybe 10% of the budget, maybe just 10% to be dedicated. Start there. For some who are kind of head over heels when they discover the green, we're going to do organic this, and we're going to do local this, and we're going to do this. We're going to have our chickens, walking into the fryer on their own accord. And we're going to, and it's just, they blow the budget, and they're good for maybe a weekend, and then they get the bill, and then there's resentments, and it really wasn't that tasty, and I don't like this stuff anyway, blah, blah, blah. And they go bust, right? Because this extremism sort of captures them. They could go with tithing, 10%, dial it back, 10%, baby steps. Be thoughtful that your food is thoughtfully raised. See if you can go to the local organic market. Start the conversations as to why you're shopping organically. Start the conversation. I go in with my local co-op and I talk about the La Leche League all the time, building those bridges between Catholic pro-life sentiments and the organic food movement. I teach a course on integral ecology. My seminarians go to the local market every time, and there the two cultures meet. My seminarians and their blacks, and the organic growers and the food workers in their blacks. And we have our dress and they have theirs. And we meet and we try to discuss why it's so important to support the local organic food movement. Catholics were totally into the local organic food movement. You can read Pius XI, you can read Mother Earth News, and you can sometimes wonder who's actually speaking here. Catholics prior to industrialization of agriculture were totally immersed in the organic food movement. Someone someday should write the history of the organic food movement within Catholicism. I think it'd be a fascinating conversation to discover. They were totally into it. So that'd be one thing. Just being more thoughtful, eating a little bit more simpler on the food chain, being much more intentional about your purchases, being much more intentional about how I spend my resources. Catholic social teaching, for example, vast amounts of literature on the production of goods. We really need just one encyclical on the consumption of goods. And I'm sure, if I stop consuming it, they'll stop making it. They're only producing these things because I keep buying those things. And if we could begin to enlighten Catholic consciences in the simplest ways, and then all of a sudden your table is a principle of evangelization. Then you invite your friend over and say, oh, you have to come because we bought this jar of honey and it's local and organic. We should really have it on some toast. And yes, it was very expensive honey, but let's see how we enjoy it. Let's see what's going on. Or we bought just one loaf of bread and it looks like it was made at the special bread store. You should come over and we should celebrate and enjoy this loaf of bread. You don't have to, abandon everything and sort of implement this complete reorientation of your life. That's going to last for a weekend. That's going to last for a week. You need longer sustainable practices. And then start adopting the church's rhythms of feasting and fasting. We talk here anyway, there's meatless Mondays in the social justice movements. Well, Catholics had meatless Fridays for decades. You start to more intentionally manage what's happening. You have feasts as well, celebrating your children's baptism, celebrating their confirmation, celebrating the liturgical events. Advent is starting next week. That used to be a penitential season. Well, maybe you would do beans and rice as the predominant dish during the Advent season. In my house, for example, we have what we call Christmas steak. It's the only time in the year that this particular meat is served. It's a nice filet and that's it. We don't do filet during the year. That's Christmas. And you really build into your rhythms a thoughtful practice. And let me tell you, for whatever it's worth, no extra charge. If you really want to reform your life, starting at the table will have the most profound impacts in your life. It sounds simple. It's actually really difficult to do because we're all attached to our favorite snacks. And we don't think we are attached to them until we ask to give them up. And then all of a sudden, you'll remember in the Christian community historically, it was really a food fight that almost tore the Christians apart. It wasn't the divinity of Jesus. It was, do we eat the meat that's tasty, been sacrificed to idols or not? That nearly blew the thing apart in Acts. And finally, Peter and Paul reconciled. Point is to say, a simple door, a simple gateway into this kind of integral ecology would be starting at the dinner table, practicing more thoughtful food, more thoughtful eating.
That's a great invitation. And we're nearing the end of our time here. So I'd like to invite Sabrina on now to pose a question to you, Professor, and we maybe do one or two more and wrap up after that.
Sure. Sorry, I
Sabrina?
went on too long. Hi, Sabrina.
Hi, thank you. I've really enjoyed listening through your talk this evening, and a couple of questions have come to mind, but I'll go with the one as I promised Peter, which is looking at the environmental movement. When the environmental movement does look towards cultural and religious traditions, often the Judeo-Christian tradition gets labeled as not being all that eco-friendly because of that, for the sake of conversation, that accusation of Genesis taught dominion over creation. And so how would a Thomist respond to that that assumption and quite honestly that take that a lot of people have used?
Yeah, right. Well, it's deep in certain strains of Christianity. The Reformers, some of the Protestant strains are going to be much more apt to look at lower creation. I don't know if you were there for that part of the talk, but look at lower creation as caught up in the problem of sin and the fall. And so their attitude towards the natural order is often, now I'm painting with a very broad brush here, so you have to forgive me, but the attitude towards the natural creation is that nature was a wasteland. And we're all drinking from the same circles and we all get caught up in that rhetoric. I can just assure you that was not the Christian rhetoric, dominant Christian rhetoric up until about the 15th century. That's when the natural order started to be treated as something to be conquered and merely conquered. That's a little bit later development. Of course, you and I are in the 20th century, so 400 years of bad discourse has its impact. But historically, I want you to know with the Thomist tradition and the Augustinian tradition, that language of nature is somehow sinful and merely to be dominated is not the rhetoric at all. So part of it is to try to recover those earlier narratives. Great question. I'm really curious as to what your other question you wanted to ask that you promised. Go for it.
I was just about to say, I'll give space to anyone else if they had a question, and thank you for that response. The Aquinas and Augustine have been my two favorites since my undergrad. So the second question was a bit of a wandering thought of when you were talking about food traditions. One of the really special traditions to the North American continent is maple syrup making. But traditionally, for a lot of Christian communities, that was not embraced as something to be to celebrate, because often that would land in Lent. So we do have a disconnect between our traditional fasting calendar and wherever our Christian communities might be on the planet, right? It might be, Lent might be falling during a season of what the surroundings would invite to be a season of abundance and joy and celebration, but Lent is asking us to cut back. So there's a bit of a disconnect there.
No, that's interesting. We are a global reality, and depending on where you are in the globe, Lent is either going to fall at the right time or the wrong time. And it sure is hard to experience Lent when all the flowers are bursting, et cetera, et cetera. In a certain sense, it's just, quick answer, top of my head. It's just a reminder that you and I, while still animal creatures with immortal souls, when we're entering into Lent, we are entering into that drama of redemption from sin. And so hopefully the focus of the theological significance of that kind of sacrifice can come to the forefront. But I'm with you. It's not necessarily the best time in North America to be entering into a fast season with all of creation seemingly ready to go in joyful celebration of life. We're the exception, at least in the North during that season.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Sabrina and Professor, and for everyone for joining us. Seems like we could go on and on.
Oh, yes.
So I'd like you, Professor, if you may share, what you're working on now. Some resources.
I've got to do another version of Green Thomism. That was more like an urgent cry, my Soylent Green moment when you say Soylent Green is people, I thought I better get it all in that book lest I get hit by a bus, right? So it has a certain whirlwind feel to it, you know, a kind of reckless rant. I'll have to calm down, I think, and develop a second series. I'm in the initial stages of working with a fantastic Joshua Cunningham. He's a landscape painter. You can Google his work here. He's very talented, local Twin Cities artist. I'd love to do a series of essays on the power of landscape, with him doing some of the art and me doing some of the commentary.
Make it something like Becoming Human by John Baer. If you've ever seen that.
No.
With these beautiful, it's a very short book. He's an Orthodox theologian. He's got these beautiful, short, meditative phrases with icons and artwork that you just pray through.
Yeah.
Becoming Human. Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to have to take a look at that. Thank you so much. That's kind of the idea. This is a local landscape artist. I'd love to somehow capture some of his insights and write about that. And then the vocation of the agricultural leader, that's a large international project that's slowly but surely coming to fruition. This is going to be December 2022. We think we're going to have a meeting with some pretty important people at the Vatican. I'll just say that. That'll champion its release and its promulgation. So slowly but surely that document is making its way into the light.
Very good. Just a small taste, I'm sure.
Sure
to link to all of those.
I do priest retreats with, I'm very involved in priest retreats with Catholic Rural Life on a 3 or 4 times a year. And then of course I'm teaching here. So life is good.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, we'll post all of those when this goes up on our YouTube channel. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. I'll just invite Matt Marquardt on, our president, to say a few closing remarks and lead us in the closing prayer.
You're muted, Matt.
Sorry, I pushed it, but I missed.
God can hear you, but we can't.
But I don't have too much to say because it was a remarkable conversation again. You guys cover a lot of ground. Sabrina cut me off a little bit. Dr. Thompson, you cut me off a little bit by going back to the practical applications. So the only thing I can ask is a request to Sabrina, who's actually very special to us at Catholic Conscience, if she wouldn't mind praying the Canticle of the Sun for us. She looks horrified, but I know she can do it.
The whole canticle, or do you mean the peace prayer?
Well, you can do the peace prayer, but I'm thinking the Canticle of the Sun. It covers everything we talked about, I think.
Okay. It's a long one.
Right?
I should have known better why you asked me to pull it up. I thought you would. I'd be more than happy to. Just let me know when you're ready. I've pulled up what I think
when you're ready. We got to let these poor people go. But I want to thank everybody too. Brilliant conversation, good questions, great comments on the side. I don't think I can add much to this.
All right. Well,
one thought. I do want to thank you for mentioning the business about the Catholic farmers and the agricultural aspects. We do a lot of things at Catholic Conscience and we work with other people, but you have made it clear to me that when we start our conversations about a sustainable economy, I need to get to you to reach out about Catholic agricultural groups that need to be a part of that conversation. So I would never have gotten her. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Over to you, Sabrina. I promise to shut up now.
All right. Well, for this Canticle of the Sun, I'll put some of the text in the chat so you can follow, but let me begin. Yeah. Most high, all powerful God, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, and the honor, and all the blessing. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and to no man is worthy to mention your name. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother, son, who brings the day, and you give light through him, and he is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor. Of you, most high, he bears the likeness. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. In heaven you formed them, clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother wind, and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather through which you give sustenance to your creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister water, which is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister Mother Earth, who sustains us and governs us, and who produces varied fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Praised be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation. Blessed are those who endure in peace, for by you, Most High, they shall be crowned. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, for whom no living man can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those who will find your most holy will, for the second death shall not do them harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Amen.
Amen. And I think probably everybody here knows it better than I do, but that's actually the source of the title of Laudato Si. Thank you. It's very nicely done.
Nicely read. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.